Lisa stood up at the head of the table, tapping her silver spoon against her champagne flute, and the entire patio went silent. Her family, her friends, her father's business partners frozen mid-action, the ocean breeze suddenly meaningless against the weight of her words. "Bruce, you can't afford me. This isn't realistic anymore." Her eyes flicked between me and her father, Carl, whose smug grin said he had orchestrated this moment perfectly. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but beneath it, a cold clarity took hold. They thought they were discarding a broke nobody, but they had no idea who I really was. I looked at the $100 bill tossed under the butter dish, at Lisa already laughing with her maid of honor, and I realized something. Dismissal complete. Calmly, I pulled out my phone and typed 5 words that would set everything in motion. Extract me. Package Alpha now. She didn't end things quietly, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about who she really was. There was no private conversation, no awkward walk down the driveway, no late-night text filled with apologies and soft language. Instead, Lisa stood up at the head of the long outdoor table, lifted a silver spoon, and tapped it against her champagne flute until every conversation on the patio died instantly. 20 people fell silent at once, her family, her friends, her father's business partners, each of them turning their attention toward us like an audience that hadn't known a performance was scheduled but was now settling in for one anyway. The ocean breeze rattled the umbrellas surrounding the table at this rented Hamptons estate, but the air itself felt heavy, compressed, as if the entire zip code had taken a collective breath and forgotten how to exhale. Lisa looked at me first, her expression smooth and controlled, then shifted her gaze to her father, Carl, who was swirling his scotch with a slow, deliberate motion, his mouth curled into a look of pure, practiced smugness. "I think we've all been polite long enough," she said, her voice calm, measured, and unmistakably rehearsed, as she smoothed the front of her white silk dress the way someone does right before delivering a speech they've practiced in their head. "Bruce, it's just not realistic anymore." A few people shifted in their seats, forks hovering midair, sensing something sharp was coming. She gestured lightly around her, toward the ocean, the estate, the catered white party elegance. "Look around," she continued. "This is the life I'm building, and you," she tilted her head slightly, almost sympathetic, "you're sweet, you really are, but you're dragging me down to a tax bracket I have no intention of visiting." A harsh snicker cut through the silence, too loud, too intentional, and my stomach tightened as I realized this wasn't just a breakup, it was an execution. I sat there gripping my fork, feeling heat crawl up my neck, not just from the rejection, but from the ambush itself. We had been here 4 days. 4 days of her family treating me like the help, making comments about my cute little job, joking about my dented Ford Explorer like it was a character flaw instead of a car. This was the finale, the proof of loyalty moment meant to show her father she was ready to level up. "Don't look so shocked," she added, tossing her hair back as if this were all obvious. "You knew this was temporary. You had to know." That's when Carl leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table with the confidence of a man who believed money made him untouchable. "She's doing you a favor, son," he said, his words slurred just enough to carry arrogance instead of warmth. "Cut the dead weight now before you drown trying to keep up." Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it across the table. It landed face down in the butter dish, instantly soaked with grease, insulting, deliberate, perfect. A lesser version of me would have exploded, flipped the table, or walked out humiliated. Instead, something colder took over. The noise of the party faded, replaced by a steady, focused hum in my ears. In that moment, I wasn't angry, I was clear. Because they thought they were discarding a broke nobody, a disposable placeholder who had overstayed his welcome. They had no idea they were laughing at the one person at that table who could dismantle their entire world without raising his voice. After the $100 bill landed in the butter dish and the laughter thinned into awkward murmurs, something unexpected happened inside me. I didn't feel small. I felt empty in a way that was precise, surgical, almost clean. The humiliation didn't spread like a wildfire the way it should have. It collapsed inward and settled into a cold, steady clarity that quieted everything else. I sat there for a moment longer, watching Lisa already turn away from me, laughing with her maid of honor as if the last 14 months had been nothing more than a failed appetizer. Dismissal complete. That was when I realized the performance wasn't for me at all. It was for her father, for the guests, for the imaginary jury she believed was judging her future. I looked down at the table again, at the greasy bill, at the pristine white tablecloth now permanently stained, and felt something in me detach. "You're right," I said finally, my voice even enough to surprise myself. A few heads turned back in my direction, expecting an outburst, a plea, some last attempt at dignity. I don't belong here. There was no tremor in my hands as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. One text, 5 words, "Extract me. Package Alpha now." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, lifted my glass, and finished the drink in one smooth motion while Carl stared at me like I'd just failed a test he was eager to grade. In that moment, I wasn't leaving in shame. I was waiting. What none of them understood, what they couldn't understand, was that this was the cost of the life I'd chosen to live quietly. 3 years earlier, I had made a deliberate decision to disappear in plain sight. I told people I worked in logistics support, back-end systems, the kind of job no one asks follow-up questions about because it sounds both boring and vaguely technical. The truth was far less convenient for social situations. I had founded a proprietary algorithm for high-frequency maritime shipping, one that optimized routes and fuel consumption across nearly 40% of global cargo traffic. 2 years ago, I sold the majority stake to a multinational conglomerate for $215 million, kept my board seat, and retained enough equity to ensure I would never need to explain myself to anyone ever again, if I chose not to. And I did choose not to. Money does something corrosive to people. I'd seen it up close in my 20s. Wear the wrong watch and people ignore you. Wear a Patek Philippe and suddenly strangers laugh at jokes you didn't tell well. Drive the right car and people mistake proximity for intimacy. I didn't want that world, so I stepped out of it. I drove a dented Ford Explorer, rented a modest apartment in Queens, wore plain t-shirts without logos, and built a life where people had to like me without a balance sheet doing the talking. That experiment had led me to Lisa, and until that night, I believed it had worked. As I sat there waiting, listening to the ocean and the faint clinking of glasses behind me, I understood something painful and necessary. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of cruelty under pressure. This was who she was when she thought the masks were off. The helicopter hadn't arrived yet, but the exit had already begun. The days after the Hamptons incident didn't explode the way people expect moments like that to. They contracted instead, growing quieter, tighter, as if the world itself had decided to lean in and watch what I would do next. And that silence was more unnerving than any confrontation could have been, because for the first time since Lisa's public dismissal, I wasn't reacting to humiliation or shock. I was sitting inside a deliberate pause, a self-imposed stillness that required far more control than action ever would. And every instinct in me, pride, anger, wounded ego, kept pushing for some form of response, a correction, a revelation. But I understood something crucial now. The moment I rushed to prove anything, I would lose the narrative I hadn't yet fully shaped. So instead, I returned to Queens, to the decoy apartment, to the dented Ford, to the routines that had always insulated me, and I watched the ripples spread outward without touching them. Lisa's texts coming in waves that shifted tone every few hours, confusion, defensiveness, nostalgia, apology, each message revealing more about her internal calculus than any argument ever could, because when someone believes they've mispriced a situation, they don't ask how they hurt you, they ask how wrong they were about your value, and that distinction mattered to me more than the words themselves. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty, but out of discipline, because silence forces people to fill the void with their own truths. And in that vacuum, I learned more than I could have by engaging, noticing how quickly her concern pivoted from me to optics, from "are you okay" to "what are people saying," from private remorse to public damage control. And it confirmed something I'd been reluctant to accept. The humiliation wasn't a mistake born of stress or pressure. It was a calculated performance, one she believed would elevate her standing in a room that rewarded dominance over decency. During that same stretch of days, subtle external signals began to surface, mutual acquaintances growing awkward, conversations stalling mid-sentence, a sudden politeness where casual warmth used to be. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction to indicate that the story was already circulating without my participation, distorted by speculation, exaggerated by gossip, but undeniably alive. And I resisted the temptation to correct it, because clarity offered too early can collapse leverage, and leverage, I'd learned the hard way, isn't about power, it's about timing. At night, I lay awake longer than usual, not replaying the dinner or Carl's smirk or the $100 bill in the butter dish, but interrogating myself, asking why the restraint felt heavier now than it ever had before. And the answer was uncomfortable but honest, because waiting meant accepting that I couldn't control how long I would be misunderstood. And for someone who had spent years engineering outcomes, optimizing systems, predicting behavior, that uncertainty was its own form of exposure. Still, I held position, logging details mentally without obsession, noting which friends stayed neutral, which quietly vanished, which suddenly resurfaced with curiosity disguised as concern. And through it all, I kept reminding myself that reaction is easy. Patience is expensive, and I was paying for it in sleeplessness, in clenched jaws during mundane conversations, in the constant low-grade awareness that every day I remained silent, the stakes were shifting in ways I couldn't fully see yet, only sense, like pressure building beneath the surface of still water. And I understood then that this phase wasn't about proving I was something more than they thought. It was about deciding whether I was willing to let them reveal exactly who they were when they believed the door was already closed. By the time Thursday rolled around, subtle patterns were emerging like footprints in sand, small behaviors that revealed the undercurrents of Lisa's world and her family's assumptions about me, and I began cataloging them quietly, deliberately, without anyone suspecting that I was paying attention. Because true advantage is always invisible until it's too late to counter. I noticed how Lisa's eyes darted whenever Trent mentioned a yacht or a club, the way her laughter shifted from genuine warmth to measured amusement, and how her father, Carl, subtly flexed his influence, name-dropping ventures, stakes, and insider connections as if they were armor against anyone not fluent in their code. And these details weren't accidental. They were signals, markers of priority, and I had spent years learning to read them, whether in boardrooms or shipping lanes, translating small gestures into actionable intelligence. And I realized that I wasn't angry anymore, not at them, not at her, because anger is short-lived, reactive, visible. What mattered now was comprehension, the kind that lets you decide the exact moment to act. I also cataloged the ways she tolerated me in public versus private, the tiny dismissals, the barely audible sighs, the way she corrected me subtly in conversation, like grading an essay I hadn't submitted. And I began to see the broader system. The Hamptons was a microcosm of social currency, a network where perception and influence were everything, and I had been evaluated, scored, and found wanting by standards I had only partially understood until that week. It was fascinating, in a clinical sense, to witness how ambition, fear, and superficial metrics could warp a person's moral compass, turning someone you thought you knew into a participant in a carefully orchestrated performance. And I cataloged every smile, every frown, every dismissive glance like data points, understanding that each would inform the strategy I would eventually deploy. Simultaneously, I observed my own reactions, the heat rising when Lisa's cousin snickered, the subtle tension in my shoulders, the temptation to reveal truths I wasn't ready to disclose. And I reminded myself that restraint is a weapon, patience a shield, and timing the ultimate leverage. The pattern became increasingly clear. Their world was transactional, relationships measured in visibility and returns, and they believed that money defined worth entirely, blind to the nuance of skill, intellect, or silent mastery. And I understood then that my low-profile lifestyle, the Queen's apartment, the dented Ford, the unbranded T-shirts, wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but a tactical advantage, an observation post in plain sight. Each day became a careful exercise in neutrality, appearing present but disengaged, listening but not revealing, calculating yet outwardly indifferent. And with every meal, every shared joke I observed from the margins, I could see the cracks forming, the subtle fractures in confidence, the missteps driven by overestimation and hubris, and it was mesmerizing. I had crossed the threshold from humiliation to analysis, moving from the emotional to the strategic, from reactive to deliberate, and by the time the weekend arrived, I was no longer merely the guest at their table. I was the observer in control, charting patterns, waiting for the moment when understanding would translate into opportunity, aware that in this environment, the smallest insight, the briefest recognition of true value could become the lever that tipped the balance entirely in my favor. The following week unfolded like a carefully choreographed exercise in social navigation, each day offering me new insight into the ecosystem I had entered, and I moved through it with quiet precision, aware that every interaction, every glance, every tiny micro-gesture revealed more than words ever could. Monday began with a breakfast where I watched Lisa's eyes wander to Trent as he recounted a recent luxury trip, noting how she mirrored his posture, laughed just a fraction longer at his jokes, and subconsciously adjusted her tone to match his energy. Small calibrations that exposed her true priorities without a single confrontation. The afternoon brought a golf outing with Carl, Sterling, and Trent, ostensibly a leisure activity, but in reality a theater of subtle power dynamics, where Carl flexed his knowledge of land acquisitions, Sterling teased about past business deals, and Trent fished for recognition, all the while Lisa's attention flicking between the men as if they were rare commodities to be appraised and collected. And I silently cataloged each behavior, each indicator of desire and insecurity, understanding that observation was the most potent weapon in this environment, more potent than confrontation or argument, and I felt no need to compete openly, because the structural advantage lay in patience, in quietly noting patterns that others ignored. By Wednesday, the subtle social hierarchy had become obvious. Carl and his inner circle wielded influence through performative gestures, through references to money, reputation, and legacy, while Lisa acted as a conduit, amplifying or deflecting attention based on perceived opportunity, and I, seemingly on the periphery, gathered intelligence, noting not only the overt displays, but the micro-fissures, the irritation in Carl's tone when I disagreed, the fleeting frustration in Lisa's smile when her plans didn't align with the room, the barely noticeable exhale of Trent when attention shifted away from him, all tiny threads weaving a map of relational leverage that only a trained eye could detect. Each meal became a study in human psychology, each conversation a lesson in restraint and timing, as I positioned myself invisibly, listening for cues, understanding the rhythms of social exchange, and reinforcing my own narrative of benign neutrality, present, polite, unthreatening, yet absorbing every detail that would later dictate precise action. By Thursday, I had begun to sense how predictable the patterns were, how easily they revealed priorities, weaknesses, and assumptions, and I realized that the power they thought they wielded, the social hierarchy, the judgments, the dismissive glances, was merely a mirror of their own insecurities, and while they evaluated me as insignificant, I held a quiet leverage they could not perceive. By the end of the week, I was no longer just Bruce, the boyfriend in Queens, but an unseen strategist embedded in their world, collecting data, calculating moves, understanding that true advantage comes not from immediate retaliation or display of power, but from meticulous observation, silent comprehension, and deliberate restraint, a mindset that allowed me to turn humiliation into intelligence and weakness into opportunity. preparing me for the moment when patience, knowledge, and timing would converge into absolute leverage. By the time Thursday evening rolled around, the threads I had been quietly weaving during the week began to form a clear picture, a lattice of opportunity hidden in plain sight, and I realized that every insult, every dismissive glance, every snicker at my expense was not just a slight, but a data point, a measure of priorities and perception, and I began running mental algorithms, calculating the leverage each participant held and the vulnerabilities they exposed, noting how Carl's overconfidence made him blind to subtle financial discrepancies, how Lisa's need to impress and validate her social circle left her dependent on external affirmation, and how Trent's arrogance created cracks in the structure of influence he believed he controlled. I spent hours mentally charting scenarios, identifying the most impactful moves with the least exposure, mapping contingencies in case anyone deviated from expected behavior, all while maintaining an outward appearance of polite disinterest, sipping my drink with the patience of a chess master, allowing the interactions round me to unfold naturally, yet absorbing the underlying mechanics like a sponge. I watched Lisa throughout the dinner, noting how she tried to subtly manipulate attention, redirecting conversation to highlight Trent's supposed charm, and yet each maneuver revealed her own insecurities, a blind dependence on perceived status rather than genuine connection, and I cataloged these micro-moments with precision, understanding that the true reveal would not be in overt confrontation, but in orchestrating a situation where truth became self-evident, where the facade crumbled without a word from me, leaving them to witness their own errors in judgment. The golf outing earlier in the week replayed in my mind as a masterclass in behavioral economics. Carl's need to assert dominance through anecdotal wealth, Sterling's insecurity thinly veiled with humor, Trent's performative posturing, all predictable and consistent, and I recognized that I had been underestimated at every turn, judged by appearances rather than capability, and that misjudgment would be my instrument, a silent weapon far more effective than anger or rebuttal. By Friday, I had refined the strategy. Allow them to escalate their own pretense, create a narrative where their hubris would be exposed without force, and time the intervention to maximize both impact and clarity, ensuring that when the moment arrived, the truth would not feel like vengeance, but like inevitability, a natural consequence of their own miscalculations. I understood that patience was not passivity, observation was not neutrality, and silence was not surrender. It was strategy in its purest form, a disciplined approach that converted insult into intelligence, rejection into insight, and apparent weakness into a position of unassailable leverage, all while remaining entirely invisible in the theater of their own making. Friday morning arrived, deceptively quiet. The Hamptons estate bathed in soft sunlight that belied the tension simmering just beneath the surface, and I used that lull to prepare mentally for the evening's culmination, reviewing every interaction of the past days like a meticulous audit, noting how each glance, gesture, and comment revealed the true priorities of those around me. Lisa's subtle eye rolls, the half-smiles masked with politeness, Carl's habitual chest-thumping and declarative statements about wealth, Trent's overcompensated charm, even the staff's nervous movements, they were all part of the system I was learning to read, a complex web of egos and expectations, and I realized that the entire week had been giving me data, raw inputs to refine my plan, to understand who believed what, who feared what, and who would crumble first when confronted with undeniable truth. I walked the grounds alone, letting the ocean breeze clear my mind, while also noticing small details, the alignment of chairs, the placement of glassware, the angle of the sun against the deck, all minor yet psychologically impactful, contributing to the stage I would soon control without overt action. And in that moment of calm, I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation, the kind that comes from knowing the rules of the game better than anyone else in the room. I reflected on the past 14 months of pretending, of hiding my real self behind a modest exterior, driving a dented Explorer, wearing unbranded tees, living in Queens, all deliberate choices to test loyalty, authenticity, and judgment. And now, every insult, every slight, every dismissive comment from Lisa and her circle had been cataloged and converted into a blueprint for influence, a strategic dossier that required no violence, no shouting, only timing and precision. I reviewed the helicopter extraction plan in my mind, the call to Marcus, the coordination of logistics, and even the smallest contingencies, while simultaneously rehearsing the calm, controlled demeanor I would display during the white party dinner, because in high-stakes social strategy, perception is as important as reality, and I intended to make the disparity between appearance and truth impossible to ignore. As the afternoon faded into golden hour, I sipped my scotch, feeling the hum of the estate around me, knowing that every moment of patience had been an investment, every slight had been an opportunity, and when the time came, I would not just reveal wealth or power, I would demonstrate discernment, intelligence, and restraint, turning what they believed to be my weakness into an unassailable strength. And in that deceptive calm, I understood that the real storm was not the helicopter, not the money, but the unveiling of character, of priorities, of the truths people spend years hiding from themselves. And the impending evening promised that revelation in a way they could never argue with. The evening arrived, crisp and luminous, the entire estate awash in coordinated whites, linens, and gleaming glassware, a visual symphony of wealth and refinement designed to impress, intimidate, and subtly remind everyone of the hierarchy Lisa and her father had painstakingly curated. And I stepped onto that deck with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent the week reading the room, cataloging each interaction, predicting each slight, and measuring every social pulse, all while remaining invisible to most, a ghost within the opulent chaos. The table for 20 was set like a chessboard, guests seated according to family alliances, business connections, and social capital, every placement a calculated statement about status. And I found my spot at the far end, strategically distanced from Lisa, yet perfectly positioned to observe, to analyze, and to absorb the information I had been collecting, like a general surveying a battlefield before the first move. Lisa, radiant in silk and poise, held court at the head, flanked by her father, Carl, the embodiment of inherited arrogance, and Trent, the obvious upgrade in her eyes. And as the evening unfolded, every interaction reinforced the roles. The laughter that excluded me, the subtle dismissals, the whispered evaluations that I could hear just beneath the polite clinking of silverware, all building toward the inevitable climax, while I remained outwardly calm, sipping the provided scotch, letting each insult, each slight, each glance of superiority wash over me like water on stone, undisturbed, collected, and deliberate. I noticed the smallest details, the angle of Lisa's gaze when she thought no one was watching, the tension in Carl's jaw when he sensed control slipping, Trent's nervous attempts to assert dominance, all data points in a larger strategy that had been weeks in the making. And I knew the helicopter extraction was imminent, the plan rehearsed to the second. Yet the real power lay not in the spectacle of arrival, but in the contrast it would draw between perception and reality, between assumed weakness and actual command. My phone lay ready, the single text prepped, a trigger that would convert patience into action. And as I surveyed the guests, their expressions, the pristine white tablecloths, the expensive wine, and the undercurrent of social posturing, I felt a quiet thrill, a deep satisfaction that comes from understanding the game better than anyone else in the room. And I realized that this night was about more than revenge or demonstration of wealth. It was about revealing truth, stripping away illusions, and letting people confront the reality they had ignored while I had quietly endured, observed, and planned, all in measured silence, waiting for the exact moment to shift the balance. And in that waiting, the tension built, palpable, almost electric, because every second of patience had amplified its impact.
And soon, very soon, the masquerade would crumble under the weight of what they had failed to see. The man they thought they could dismiss was quietly orchestrating the lesson of a lifetime.
The low thrum began subtly, almost imperceptible at first, a vibration that rattled the glasses and shifted the napkins on the immaculate white tables. And then, suddenly, the world outside the estate exploded into chaos as a matte black Sorsky S-76 helicopter descended, cutting through the warm Atlantic breeze with authority. Rotors whipping sand, leaves, and loose decorations across the manicured lawn, turning the white party into a whirlwind of stunned gasps, scattered cocktail napkins, and wide-eyed disbelief. Marcus leaned out the side, tactical vest and sunglasses giving him the presence of a secret operative rather than a mere chauffeur. And as I lifted my glass of scotch, deliberately placing it back on the railing with an audible clink, I felt the exquisite satisfaction of watching anticipation meet execution, of seeing every insult, every sneer, and every microaggression met with calm, calculated response. A demonstration not of raw force, but of quiet control. Lisa's mouth hung open, Trent's fork clattered to the floor, and Carl's face shifted from arrogant confidence to pale, flustered disbelief, a visceral confirmation of weeks of patience and observation. And I knew that the moment had crystallized the truth they had refused to acknowledge. I was not the man they assumed I was, the underdog they could dismiss or patronize, but a force with reach, influence, and intellect that far surpassed their assumptions. As I walked past the table, every eye frozen on me, I let my gaze linger on Lisa, letting her witness the contrast between the person she thought she knew and the reality she had ignored. And when I said softly, over the roar of the rotors, "That's my ride," it wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration, a subtle but undeniable assertion that the narrative she had been scripting in her mind for months was about to be rewritten. Climbing into the helicopter, feeling the leather seat and cold beer waiting, I experienced a satisfaction deeper than wealth, deeper than revenge. The calm power of restraint, of patience turned to precise action, of preparation meeting perfect timing. And as we lifted into the sky, the estate shrinking beneath us, the white party reduced to a blur of shocked expressions, napkins, and flying hair, I felt a quiet thrill at the knowledge that this was not an impulsive reaction, but the payoff of strategy, observation, and unshakable composure. A lesson in perception, patience, and the devastating impact of being underestimated. And as the city skyline grew closer, lights twinkling like tiny stars in the night, I understood that the true victory was not the spectacle itself, but the revelation that I had played the long game, seen the deception, endured the humiliation, and emerged not only unscathed, but elevated, leaving behind a tableau of chaos that spoke volumes more than words ever could. By the time we touched down in Manhattan, the helicopter had already sparked a wildfire that I hadn't fully anticipated. The spectacle of arrival at Lisa's carefully curated white party had spread faster than I could check my phone, and within minutes, notifications began pouring in. Texts, missed calls, social media tags, friends sending video clips, all capturing that perfect storm of disbelief, awe, and subtle humiliation that I had orchestrated without a word. Trent, the hedge fund clown, had already posted a snippet with the caption, "Holy, Bruce isn't broke," and suddenly the narrative flipped, Lisa's casual dismissal now juxtaposed against undeniable proof of wealth and strategic patience, a social reversal that was both intoxicating and instructive. I watched the city lights from my Tribeca penthouse as the clip circulated, noting how quickly the truth could dislodge false assumptions, and felt the subtle, almost imperceptible thrill of seeing arrogance humbled, of seeing power recognized without violence, simply through timing and visibility. Lisa's first messages came at 10:45 p.m., pleading, questioning, trying to reclaim control.
Then a desperate 2 a.m. text claiming, "I'm outside your apartment, we are going to fix this," which I ignored with deliberate precision, knowing the lesson needed to settle fully, the public humiliation tempered by a controlled, private absence, reinforcing that her expectations of influence and manipulation would no longer hold sway over me. Behind the spectacle, however, were quieter victories. The financial leverage I maintained over Carl, Lisa's father, who had overextended himself. The board seat I held that allowed me to intercept and halt the partnership that had been his lifeline. And within 48 hours, the deal evaporated. Carl's empire revealed to be far more fragile than he allowed others to believe, proving the old adage that real power lies in preparation, subtlety, and the knowledge of leverage. And when he called, frantic, apologetic, I didn't answer, because the lesson was not about revenge, but about letting consequence speak louder than confrontation. Friends whispered about Lisa's social fallout, how her failure to recognize true substance had made her radioactive in the financial and dating circles, while I sat quietly, noting the irony, appreciating the layers of public and private victory, the way perception and reality had collided in a way that left her scrambling and me untouchable, a masterclass in strategy without aggression. And even as the dust settled, I reminded myself that the spectacle was only part one, that patience, composure, and the disciplined application of resources, not impulse, would define the next chapters, that the real triumph was enduring the humiliation, observing the behavior, and choosing the precise moment to act, reinforcing that power is most effectively wielded not when visible, but when deliberate, calculated, and undeniable. In the days following the helicopter reveal, the social consequences unfolded like clockwork. Each interaction, each whispered conversation, a small testament to the careful orchestration of timing and restraint. Lisa's carefully cultivated image began to unravel as friends, acquaintances, and even casual contacts shared the viral video, her status as a potential upgrade now exposed as a misjudgment. And I observed it all from a distance, letting the truth circulate without interference, because in this game, patience magnifies impact far more than confrontation ever could. Carl, once the confident patriarch of the Hampton estate, now called from multiple numbers, his voice tight with desperation, pleading for intervention, but I remained steadfast, recognizing that influence is far more powerful when quiet, when measured, and when paired with absolute self-control. Trent, who had positioned himself as the financial benchmark for Lisa's tastes, suddenly found his own social value diminished as the story went viral, a bystander caught in the ripple of someone else's strategic patience, proving that perception is a currency more fragile than wealth itself. Even Lisa's attempts to contact me became public fodder, texts, voicemails, and desperate social media DMs, but each one was met with deliberate non-response, a lesson in letting consequences reinforce lessons without saying a single word, reinforcing the reality that actions speak louder than apologies, and that the value of a person is measured less by who they aim to impress and more by what they genuinely contribute to the world. In this period, I also observed my own behavior, understanding that restraint doesn't mean passivity, that watching, listening, and calculating are as much a display of power as the helicopter itself, and that strategic patience creates both anticipation and inevitability, a lesson Lisa was learning far too late. The viral moment also shifted my social and professional landscape. Contacts I hadn't spoken to in months reached out, investors, partners, and colleagues, curious to understand the man who could orchestrate such a precise public statement without chaos or spectacle, and I realized that my discretion, my ability to blend invisibility with influence, was now an asset that money alone could never buy. Even as Carl scrambled to salvage deals and Lisa struggled with the social fallout, I moved forward quietly, reinforcing that true power is exercised with subtlety, that patience paired with timing creates results far beyond immediate gratification, and that letting the world see the consequences of their own choices is far more impactful than any confrontation. By the end of the week, the social fabric that Lisa had depended upon for validation had begun to erode, and I was reminded, once again, that the most effective victories are often invisible, unfolding over time, and leaving those who underestimated you to wonder how they missed the signs, proving that strategy, observation, and patience are often more formidable than wealth, status, or arrogance alone.
After the chaos of the Hamptons' dinner, I realized that the real power didn't come from spectacle. It came from subtlety, observation, and calculated patience, the kind of influence that works beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without ever drawing attention to itself. The helicopter might have grabbed headlines and exposed the financial gap between perception and reality, but the long-term advantage would come from understanding how every player reacted and anticipating the ripples of their choices. From Lisa's growing panic over her social misjudgment to Carl's fragile ego and Trent's fleeting self-importance, and even the whispers in the wider social and business circles that would quietly spread, reinforcing reputations and alliances without me needing to intervene overtly. I spent the following days analyzing the fallout, reviewing interactions, noting every slight hesitation, every faltering smile, every cautious word from people who had assumed they understood my position but had been blindsided by restraint and strategy. Each observation revealed patterns. Lisa's attempts to regain social footing were clumsy and predictable. Her friends' reactions revealed loyalty only to status, and Carl's business bravado was just that, a carefully constructed persona masking precarious financial footing, which my team and I quietly tracked to understand leverage points without ever alerting him to our awareness, knowing that restraint is more terrifying than confrontation when wielded correctly. I maintained my low-profile routine, returning to Queens, walking Buster in the park, stopping for coffee at the same corner spot, attending business dinners in understated fashion, while my presence, though seemingly ordinary, allowed me to monitor outcomes in real time, ensuring that every ripple from the helicopter event and the subsequent social fallout was magnified and compounded strategically, reinforcing lessons about perception, respect, and the subtle power of decisive patience. Meanwhile, I leveraged my professional influence carefully, making low-visibility moves in investments, tech ventures, and financial networks, testing Carl's empire through boardroom whispers, subtle negotiations, and financial nudges that didn't announce themselves publicly but forced recalculations behind closed doors, exposing weaknesses that had been hidden under layers of confidence and ego, and watching as the balance of perception and reality shifted slowly but inexorably in my favor. Observing Lisa's behavior during this period was particularly revealing, as her panic, overcompensation, and failed attempts at controlling narratives made clear that those who treat people as placeholders eventually find themselves scrambling to regain footing, reinforcing that actions carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment, and that the universe, when allowed to operate without interference, has its own way of leveling inequities. Each day, as I combined observation with subtle action, I reinforced a principle I had always believed but had rarely needed to test so publicly. Quiet dominance, strategic leverage, and patient restraint often outperform flashiness, rage, or direct confrontation, because influence compounded over time is far more impactful than any single dramatic moment. By the end of this module, the lesson was unmistakable. Power is not measured by who makes the loudest announcement, but by who understands patterns, anticipates reactions, and positions themselves to benefit from the inevitable consequences, letting others falter under the weight of their own misjudgments, while you move forward invisibly, confidently, and unassailably, setting the stage for every next step to be executed with precision, poise, and maximum effect. In the days following the helicopter spectacle and the fallout that rippled through the Hampton social circles, I settled into a rhythm that was almost meditative, a disciplined balance between outward ordinariness and inward calculation, where every small action, every casual gesture was a thread woven into a larger tapestry of influence. Because I understood now that true control doesn't shout, it waits, observes, and acts with precision. Mornings began with the mundane rituals of Queen's life, walking Buster through the quiet streets,
coffee in hand, greeting neighbors who had no idea that the man they passed daily was orchestrating outcomes far beyond their comprehension. Yet each step, each pause, each seemingly insignificant interaction provided me with information, subtle cues about character, temperament, and intentions, building a mosaic of the people I had to navigate: Lisa, Carl, Trent, and the extended network of social and financial players whose perception of me was now fractured, distorted, and ripe for strategic exploitation. I studied the social media aftermath, noting how quickly the video of the helicopter landing and Lisa's public humiliation had gone viral in select circles, how whispers turned into quiet discussions at brunches and business meetings, how reputations shifted imperceptibly yet permanently, and how the overestimation of wealth, power, or control can blind even the most self-assured people to reality. A lesson that became a guiding principle for every move I made, a reminder that timing, patience, and selective action were far more effective than overt displays of force. Meanwhile, Lisa's attempts to reassert herself were predictable in their desperation: forced smiles at gatherings, awkward justifications of behavior, and repeated overtures that hinted at her belief that the narrative could be rewritten if she performed convincingly enough. Yet her every misstep reinforced the lessons I had observed about human behavior under pressure, about how insecurity, entitlement, and ego manifest when status is threatened, and about how those who use others as placeholders inevitably expose their own weakness when the tables are turned. Professionally, I made quiet maneuvers, leveraging my influence and access in ways that appeared incidental to outsiders, yet systematically reinforced my position. Testing Carl's ventures through subtle shifts, indirect inquiries, and carefully timed suggestions to my network, all while maintaining a facade of casual detachment, ensuring that every ripple was magnified strategically without revealing my hand, and allowing natural consequences to unfold organically, proving that power often works invisibly, unseen, yet felt by those who thought themselves untouchable. The psychological landscape became my playground, the tension my tool, and restraint my weapon, because I had learned that every confrontation, every emotional reaction, and every misjudgment could be recorded, analyzed, and eventually leveraged for maximum effect. And in those quiet, deliberate days, I realized that the next move wasn't about spectacle or revenge. It was about culmination, timing, and letting others reveal their true colors fully, without interference, so that when the final pivot came, it would land with precision, clarity, and unassailable impact, leaving no room for debate, no opportunity for negotiation, and no doubt about the outcome. A lesson in patience and strategy that underscored every action and inaction alike, and that ultimately defined the difference between fleeting triumph and lasting dominance.
The morning of the extraction arrived with a quiet that felt almost sacred, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, and I moved through it with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, aware that everything, the timing, the optics, the smallest gestures would ripple outward in ways no one could predict. I woke early, keeping Buster close, taking the long walk through the streets of Queens, observing the world that thought me ordinary, noting how the delivery drivers, the baristas, the neighbors, all of them interacted with me as if I were just another man, a detail I filed mentally because invisibility, once mastered, is a weapon, and in this moment it allowed me to move freely without drawing attention to the calculated chaos that was about to unfold. Marcus was already coordinating logistics, reviewing landing zones, rotor approach, and crowd control measures at the periphery of the Hamptons estate, and the Sorsky S-76 would be in position precisely as planned, black matte, nearly invisible from a distance, a statement disguised as functionality, waiting for the signal that would turn hesitation into astonishment. I dressed simply. Plain linen shirt, dark jeans, sneakers, because image had been neutralized for years, and the power of the reveal lay not in opulence but in the contrast between expectation and reality, in letting the world witness the disparity between the loser they assumed I was and the man who commanded resources that could dismantle fortunes with a call. The drive to the city was deliberate, calculated, filled with mundane stops and delays that ensured no one could trace my trajectory, and every step reinforced the illusion that the life of Bruce, the middle-class boyfriend, had never ended, a careful misdirection that made the upcoming spectacle nearly unavoidable. The tension reaching a slow boil as I imagined Lisa at the head of the table, the expressions on Trent's face, and Carl's smug arrogance poised to shatter the second the rotors hit. As we approached the estate, the first signs of the upheaval were almost imperceptible. The napkins fluttered, a hedge tilted under the wing, voices faltering mid-laugh, and then the Sorsky descended, rotors slicing the air with deafening authority, a dark shape against the morning sun, the shockwave of power washing over everyone as reality collided with their assumptions. And I felt a serene satisfaction in knowing that the lesson had been delivered with elegance rather than rage, precision rather than chaos, because the true victory wasn't in making them fear me, it was in exposing the truth, the discrepancy between perception and reality without having to say a single word, letting the visuals, the audibility, the sheer audacity of the moment speak on my behalf. Marcus moved with professional detachment, ushering me from the deck, my glass of untouched scotch catching the sunlight, reflecting the calm composure that had defined my preparation. And as I stepped into the cabin, the whir of rotors became the soundtrack of inevitability, the aerial extraction symbolic not just of escape, but of control, mastery, and the power of patient strategy, a culmination of months of observation, planning, and restraint, leaving nothing to chance. And as the Sorsky lifted off, leaving chaos and stunned silence in its wake, I knew that this moment would be the pivot around which reputations, egos, and futures would turn, forever redefining the story, not through force or vengeance, but through the subtle, deliberate execution of a plan that only someone who understood patience, timing, and human nature could ever hope to orchestrate perfectly.
The aftermath hit like a silent tsunami, subtle at first, then unstoppable, and I watched it unfold from the perch of my Tribeca penthouse, the city lights below mirroring the chaos I had orchestrated from above. Within hours, the video of the helicopter extraction was circulating quietly at first, shared between a few curious friends, and then inevitably posted to social media by someone who didn't know the magnitude of what they had captured. And the story transformed overnight from a minor gossip item into a cautionary tale that rippled through every social and financial circle Lisa and Carl frequented, Trent included, who suddenly realized the magnitude of the mistake in underestimating someone he thought was a pawn in a larger game. And as the notifications exploded across my phone, the numbers became a chorus of astonishment, disbelief, and quiet envy. Hundreds of missed calls, texts, and inquiries that I let accumulate, unread, letting the suspense linger for the sake of clarity, because each unanswered message was a reminder to everyone watching that the man they thought powerless had always been in control. And control, unlike rage or revenge, is self-sustaining. Lisa's initial attempts to reach me were almost comic in their desperation, her texts pleading, apologizing, and even attempting rationalizations that betrayed more about her own calculations than any real remorse, while Carl's panicked calls revealed the fragility of wealth that is built on perception rather than substance, and his tone, shifting from anger to begging within minutes, underscored the lesson I had executed without uttering a single threat: the power of patience, intelligence, and control. A lesson delivered more effectively through action than words could ever achieve, leaving them to grapple with consequences they had never anticipated. And as I watched them stumble through their social and professional circles, attempting to salvage dignity that no longer existed, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in schadenfreude, but in the affirmation of strategy executed perfectly. The equilibrium of their world disrupted not by brute force, but by a demonstration of intelligence, restraint, and the deliberate subversion of expectation. And while the media coverage remained mostly subtle, the ripple effects were undeniable.
Carl's pending deals were frozen, investors questioned his credibility, and social whispers painted Lisa as someone who could not discern authenticity, someone for whom charm and position outweighed real judgment, a narrative that would shadow her in elite circles for months, all while I remained publicly invisible, quietly observing the collapse I had orchestrated. And in this silence, I found something more valuable than vindication, a confirmation of my principles, that patience, intelligence, and control always outperform impulsive retribution, that true power is exercised without theatrics, and that by allowing them to believe they had agency in this drama, I had maximized the impact of every decision I had made over the past 3 weeks, turning what could have been a simple confrontation into a systemic unraveling, a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the moment of the helicopter, redefining social hierarchies, reputations, and the perception of value in ways that no one at that white table could have anticipated. And by the end of the week, as the dust settled, the silence of my observation became the loudest statement of all. Control had shifted, strategy had triumphed, and the world now understood the cost of underestimating the man they assumed powerless.
The final reckoning arrived not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet inevitability. And I watched from the distance of my Tribeca penthouse as the consequences of the past weeks settled into the lives of those who had underestimated me, starting with Carl, whose empire, fragile even at its peak, crumbled in subtle yet devastating ways. Investors withdrew quietly but firmly, loans were called, and partnerships once dependent on appearances dissolved almost instantly, leaving him scrambling to salvage credibility that had evaporated in the same instant the helicopter touched down on his lawn. While Lisa, forced to confront her own judgment and the vanity that had driven her, disappeared from the social circuits she had once dominated, blocked on every platform, whispered about in the corridors of her professional world, and reduced to observing the man she tried to humiliate from afar, her carefully curated persona no longer capable of masking the ripple effects of her choices. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my routines with a sense of liberation that only comes from reclaiming agency, enjoying the simple joys I had long ignored in my quest for authenticity: wings at a dive bar in Queens, mornings with Buster at the dog park, conversations with new friends that carried curiosity instead of expectation. And even as I drove my Aston Martin DB11, purchased not to flaunt wealth but to satisfy a quiet personal desire, I felt no need to prove, no compulsion to display, no hunger for revenge, because the work had already been done, the lesson taught, and the balance restored in a way that words or confrontation could never have achieved. And in this new chapter, I discovered that true power lies in presence, observation, and discipline, not in anger or overt retaliation. That the patience to let consequences unfold naturally always yields a more satisfying and lasting result than impulsive action. And as I observed the news, social commentary, and even mutual acquaintances processing what had occurred, I understood that the world had shifted subtly around me. People now measured character rather than currency, intentions rather than optics, and while some remained blind to it, the silent authority of strategy, timing, and calm resolve had permanently altered the perception of who I was and what I represented, giving me not only financial freedom, but emotional and psychological closure, a peace that comes from seeing reality align with principle, from watching those who misjudged you learn the true cost of their assumptions without a single vindictive word uttered. And as I reflected on the past months, I realized that the lesson extended beyond Lisa and Carl to anyone who had ever assumed they could define your worth, because I had become someone impervious to their judgments, capable of living on my own terms. And finally, as the city lights shimmered on the Hudson and Buster curled at my feet, I smiled at the irony.
The man they tried to dismiss as inadequate had not only survived, but thrived, quietly, deliberately, and entirely on his own terms, leaving the past and those who miscalculated it behind, while the future remained an open horizon full of curiosity, freedom, and unshakable self-respect.